Welcome to the Indie Film Hustle Podcast, episode number 193. A director's job is to make something happen, and it doesn't happen by itself. So you cajole, you flatter, you tell them what they want to hear just to get it done. If you don't bring that passion and that intensity to it, you shouldn't be doing it. James Cameron.
Broadcasting from the back alley in Hollywood, it's the Indie Film Hustle Podcast, where we show you how to survive and thrive as an indie filmmaker in the jungles of the film biz. And here's your host, Alex Ferrari.
Welcome, my Indie Film Hustlers, to another episode of the Indie Film Hustle Podcast. I am your humble host, Alex Ferrari. Now, today's show is sponsored by TaylorSound.com. One of the most complicated problems I've had in my professional career is sound, and sound mixing, sound design is generally always very expensive. But Taylor Sound has come onto the scene and has done something pretty incredible. Like so many other things you have in the world today, now you can get your sound design online. They're offering flat promotional rates for commercials, music videos, short films, and any other video content that's short form. They're very affordable, and because you are an Indie Film Hustle Tribe member, we'll get 15% off your order. Just type in the word hustle in the post your brief section. That's TAILOR sound.com. So today is the eve of Halloween, and I thought we have a spooky episode of the Indie Film Hustle Podcast, but yet informative on the filmmaking process. And today's guest is Jeffery Michael Bays, and he wrote a book called Suspense with the Camera, The Filmmaker's Guide to Hitchcock's Techniques. And I actually wrote a quote for the book, which is on the back cover, because I love the book. I am a huge Hitchcock fan, and what Alfred Hitchcock did, he's a master, and especially a master of suspense, as his moniker states. But to create suspense, to create thrills, excitement with camera movement is something that I think is a lost art in a lot of today's films, and a lot of filmmakers in today's world they don't take the time to learn that craft. And Jeffery has done us a favor to put all of Hitchcock's techniques in this amazing book. And I wanted to have him on the show to talk about how Hitchcock does what he did, and really dive deep into creating suspense in your movies. And they could be suspense in a comedy, it could be suspense in a thriller, a horror, an action movie, whatever. As a director, as a filmmaker, understanding how to create suspense in a scene is crucial. And Hitchcock, in many ways, did it on low budgets. He was able to create suspense without showing a lot. He created more with not showing. And that technique is super valuable, not only in the storytelling process, but in the indie film world, where a lot of times we don't have the money to show the monster. And it's much more effective not to show the monster until the very, very end, or not at all. It's like some movies. But without any further ado, let's dive into it. Enjoy my conversation with Jeffery Michael Bays. I'd like to welcome to the show Jeffery Michael Bays. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Thanks for being on the show, man, and hopefully teaching us how to scare the crap out of people.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan.
Thank you, man. Thank you. And I'm a big fan of yours as well. Your book, Suspense with a Camera, The Filmmaker's Guide to Hitchcock's Techniques. It just resonates with me because I'm such a huge Hitchcock fan. He's probably one of my top 5 directors of all time. And I think a lot of the newer generation of filmmakers are doing themselves a disservice by not studying Hitchcock and his techniques. I mean, he is a master.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, he started in the 1920s, and that's when it was like right before the transition to sound. Mm-hmm. And so he learned with a lot of visual filmmakers, silent film days. And so a lot of those techniques that he developed over the years, they actually came from the silent film era, which, it's kind of a lost art at this point.
Right, because he didn't really care much about dialogue. It wasn't like a thing for him. He was all about the visuals. And in the old silent era, there was no dialogue, so you had to tell your story visually, and that's kind of, he started that way and kind of developed that same technique over the years. So if you can combine good dialogue with his technique, I mean, you've got an amazing movie.
That's true. And the funny thing about that is that he actually started out as a title designer, because they did have dialogue actually in silent films. It was actually text on the screen.
Sure, of course.
Right? So and nobody liked that. That was really inconvenient, and it was just as annoying then as it would have been today. The idea was to tell the story with the least amount of those interruptions with the title cards. So the fact that he started out designing title cards kind of tells you everything about why he, when he started directing, that he didn't want to use any dialogue because it was just
a pain.
Yeah.
It's a pain in the butt to do.
Exactly.
Now, why did you decide to go down the rabbit hole on Hitchcock as opposed to any other of the amazing directors in cinema history?
Well, I guess it's always just been around with me since I was a kid. I started watching Hitchcock when I was 15. I was actually forced to watch Rear Window. It was
so
like,
good.
I wasn't expecting anything, because, a 15-year-old old movie, this is going to be boring. There's nothing, I'm going to be, tortured by watching this. And then, as it went on, I started to realize, wait, there's something different about this. It's pulled me in somehow. There's a feeling of, you feel present in the moment. There's something live about it. So there's just something different about what Hitchcock was doing, and that caught my attention as a 15-year-old. And so I think that kind of started my interest. And then as I got into filmmaking, went to college, I just kept learning more and more about his techniques. And I guess I'm still at it.
I mean, he made like how many films total? I think it was a lot.
About 50.
Yeah.
52, I think is the exact number. There's one that's missing, I think, that's no longer in existence. But
that we know of. Hopefully it will be found in a vault somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, his first was The Lodger, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That was one of the first. It actually came out about the same time. Now, here's the thing about his first three films is that they were actually filmed in a different sequence than they were released, because his first film, which I've forgotten the name of it already, but it wasn't released until like a year after
production.
The next film, because I guess the producers didn't like it, and then they realized, oh, wait a minute, it actually is pretty good. So,
but he was doing some amazing stuff even back then, like seeing through floors, and that was very revolutionary at the time. Like, so you could actually see the footsteps above you and things like that. He was already thinking at such a different level than the rest of the filmmakers at the time. That was pretty amazing. Now, can you answer this very basic question? What is suspense?
Well, nobody really knows. Nobody can agree on the answer. In fact, film theorists and psychologists don't agree. So,
right.
Psychologists think that it's about uncertainty, that you're uncertain about the outcome. You want the good thing to happen, but you're afraid the bad thing's going to happen. But film theorists have kind of turned that on its head, and there's this thing called the paradox of suspense. Okay, so to get into a little bit of science here, what they found is that if you watch a film the second time, the suspense is even greater in some cases. So how does that make sense? If you know what's going to happen, then there really is no uncertainty the second time you watch it, right?
Right.
It's not really about uncertainty at all. It's more just about setting up these situations of fear in which a secret is about to be released to the other characters, or something bad is going to happen. But it's that moment where you provoke the audience into wanting to reach into the screen and fix things to prevent a tragedy. And it's that audience provocation. That's what suspense is.
Now, if I remember correctly, and you can definitely correct me on this, I saw an interview with Hitchcock before, and his definition of suspense was if you're sitting at that table in the middle of like in a restaurant somewhere, and two people are talking about nothing, just talking about their daily life, and all of a sudden an explosion happens and everyone dies in the building. there's no suspense there. But at the beginning, if you feed the audience just as they're sitting down talking. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show. That there's a bomb underneath, and now they're talking about baseball. Everyone in the audience is like, stop talking about baseball. And that creates this kind of suspense. But he said the one rule that you can never break is you can never let the bomb go off. Because if it does, the audience will be very pissed. And he did it in one movie, and he says, and the audience was very square with me. As he would say. Have you heard that story?
Yeah, that's his bomb theory. And basically that's just about giving the audience more information than the characters have, so that you know what's going to happen, or you think you know what's going to happen. See, that's the key, is that you build the audience up to think they know what's happening or what's about to happen. And then you pull the rug out at the last minute and something else happens instead. And that twist is what makes the suspense enjoyable. Because if you just let the bomb go off, after 5 minutes of suspense, then it's like, oh, okay, the bomb went off, and that's kind of boring.
Yeah, right. But if they escape the danger, it becomes a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, can you tell the audience what a MacGuffin is?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I know it's a tough question sometimes, but
you're throwing curveballs here already. Yeah. So a MacGuffin is, well, it's been around for centuries in storytelling. It's kind of like a plot device. It's, the things that the villains are after. It's like the secret plans that they have to try to get. And, it's a reason for the story to happen. Mm-hmm. But with Hitchcock, it's more about, it's a reason that doesn't matter.
Right. He doesn't care. He doesn't really care about if it's microfilm or plans for a nuclear bomb or some sort of chemical. He doesn't care.
Right. It's almost like X in an algebraic equation.
Right.
It could be anything. It's a variable. You change it to something else, the story stays the same.
Right. Because the action, everyone's still trying to protect that or get that. So the actual thing doesn't really matter as much for him.
Exactly. So even in a psychological film where, like, for instance, Marnie, which is one of his later films, the MacGuffin in Marnie is the color red, because that's the thing that freaks her out. She's got this kind of psychological hang up about every time she sees red, then she freaks out. That's the MacGuffin. It could be anything, right? She could freak out about bunny rabbits or, anything. It's still the same story, because the story is actually about the other guy blackmailing her, to control her.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, because a lot of people don't understand what the MacGuffin is. So hopefully the audience has a little bit of better understanding what that is now.
Yeah, and in the book, I kind of break that down into some different ways you can use it. So it's one of those things that I think it's the reason the Hitchcock it became prevalent in his works is because he was such a visual storyteller. Mm-hmm. And there's something about when you're using the camera to tell a story, you're able to move the camera around the scene and give the audience different perspectives. You bring the audience into the character in such an intimate level that a lot of the story isn't really quite as prominent anymore. And what I mean by that is that on the stage, it's mostly dialogue.
Right.
The actors are speaking dialogue, and it's dramatics of talking back and forth, and you have the same perspective all the way through the play, unless you move to a different seat.
Right, but arguably you're in the same perspective in the theater.
Yeah. But film is more abbreviated in its way of storytelling, so that some of these plot elements kind of fall to the wayside and aren't really quite as important, because the audience is more interested in the reaction shots and the secrets and the emotional world. So that's kind of why a MacGuffin is so important in a suspense film, is because it's kind of a throwaway, one of those things that don't matter.
Right, exactly. Now, there's a lot of suspense myths out there. Can you discuss what suspenseful lighting is and isn't?
Okay, well, yeah, and these myths that I have, they're things that you shouldn't do. Or you don't need to do if you want suspense. And it's kind of misconceptions that if, you want suspense, then it has to be dark.
Right.
You have to have shadows. You have to have, it has to be nighttime. And that's not really true. In fact, Hitchcock set out to prove that many times. He put most of his suspense in the sunshine.
Right.
The crop duster scene in North by Northwest.
Oh, so good.
It's in the middle of the afternoon, right? And, the suspense is in the middle of an open field as a plane, tries to kill Cary Grant. So lighting, it really doesn't matter so much.
It's all about the technique of creating the suspense.
And it's about the setup, it has nothing to do with being dark and spooky. I mean, you can make it dark, but it's not necessary.
Now, what are some tips you have for creating suspense with a camera? I know that's a loaded question. There's thousands of them, but just a couple.
Well, okay, with a camera, I mean, that kind of brings up the whole secrets aspect, because that's what I kind of outline in the book, is that the easiest way for a filmmaker to set up a suspense scenario is to have a secret that the protagonist knows, and none of the other characters know the secret, and you bring the audience into that secret, and then you set up suspense around, is that secret going to get out? And so you create these scenes where it almost gets out. Okay, and this secret can be anything. It can be, a dead body, which Hitchcock did a lot.
There's a few dead bodies in his movies, yes.
Yeah, there's a few, yeah.
There's a couple.
But it could be, something like a pregnancy that happens in soap operas a lot. In fact, soap operas use suspense quite often. Because these are things, that one character can hide, and then when they're, confronted by another character, the secret could almost get out, and they have to lie about it. And when the protagonist lies about it, then the audience kind of feels privileged. They know secret information, and it forms a bond with the audience. And it also provokes the audience into thinking, he just lied. That's not right. And so it gets us, involved, and it's kind of like we're involved in kind of a. And the reason this we started out talking about the camera is because the camera is the way to bring the audience into the secret.
Right.
So that you pan into an object. Or you pan into, or you zoom into a face, or during a conversation, two people are talking, and the camera focuses on one of the characters hiding something. So that's how the camera comes into play.
There's not a lot of that anymore. I don't see it as much as I used to with current day films. Is that a fair statement?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there's a lot of over the shoulder shots. And Hitchcock didn't use over-the-shoulder shots.
Any specific reason?
I think it's probably because it's what I like to think about it is that the camera is actually the audience sitting in the room, and so when you're doing the over shoulder kind of editing, you're flipping back and forth,
right?
So that the camera is not in one spot, so it's kind of disorienting, and it kind of brings you out of the moment. But if you have the camera in one place, and the two people are talking, then the way you move the camera. It makes you feel more like you're standing there watching them.
Got it. Now,
does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. No, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show. I mean, the camera, you can use the camera in so many different ways. But I think, again, a lot of, especially indie filmmakers, don't use the camera to tell their story. A lot of times they rely so much heavily on dialogue or you know, the situation to tell the story, as opposed to really crafting and using the camera as a paintbrush for your masterpiece or for your painting that you're painting. And that's what Hitchcock did arguably better than anybody else, especially in his genre, that he was able to just jump in and go out and completely get, like that shot in Notorious. It's one of my favorite shots in all of Hitchcockian film. That one shot at the top of the stairs, and he just cranes forever all the way down to finally till you see, you have no idea where the camera is going to go until you finally go into that real close up of the back of Ingmar Bergman's hand, where she has a key, which is obviously a part of the plot. And it's such an amazing shot, but you don't see that anymore. That's bold in today's world. Yeah. Is that fair?
Yeah, and that's not just some kind of random, you know, establishing shot. No. Because it's telling a story. It's visually, it's like a visual sentence. The director is saying, okay, here's a room full of people, and here's a woman, and she's holding a key, and this key is really important to this woman, and nobody else knows about it. So you've told that story just in that one long shot, and
with no dialogue.
You've made it important. Yeah, with no dialogue.
Now, in your book, you do discuss the concept of visual sentence. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's basically shot by shot. What story are you telling? And the visual sentence is ideas created by putting shots together. Mm-hmm. So that if you put together a close up of a person looking, and then you cut to something they're looking at, and then you cut back to their reaction. That is a visual sentence because you're showing what they're looking at. And with that is an idea. The example I use in the book is that a man is looking at a burlap sack. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then he looks down at a dead body. Okay. Again, with the dead bodies in Hitchcock.
Of course.
Yeah. And so when you cut back and forth from him looking to the sack and then looking at the body, then you've processed this idea that, okay, maybe he can put the body into the sack, right?
Right.
So just by visual, putting these shots together, you're getting the audience involved in the thought process of the protagonist and how they're processing, what they can do in this world. What can you do with the sack? He goes over, he gets a shovel, he gets a rope. So you kind of put these objects together, mm-hmm. and that's your story. That's your storytelling. And, you don't need dialogue for that. And this, the visual sentences, it gets more elaborate. You can add more things to it. In fact, the entire film of Rear Window is Jimmy Stewart looking out a window and then reacting to what he sees. Mm-hmm. So it's all visual sentences.
There's not a lot of dialogue in Rear Window, is there?
Well, yeah, there is.
There is dialogue, but I remember it. What I remember is not the dialogue. All I do is remember is the visuals of that movie.
Yeah.
Now, what is a Hitchcockian open?
Okay, well, that's kind of like the Notorious thing. Mm-hmm. It's the camera pulling the audience into a secretive world. So often he would start out in a public space, like a crowd of people, and then the camera would, kind of pick a person and start following that person. Or you would pan the camera across some buildings, and then you pan into a window. You pick out a window to look into, and then you go into the house and you see what's inside. So it's kind of it's bringing the audience from a public space into a private world, private secretive world. And the other thing about Hitchcock is that he always opened his films as comedies. And that kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? That
Right.
you would, if you want to build suspense, why are you opening a film as a comedy? And he did that almost exclusively throughout his career. Even North by Northwest has kind of comic music in the opening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because he thought that first you want the audience to start to like the characters and to have fun with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're having fun, if they're, if it's comedic, then you care about them more before something bad happens. And it also creates kind of a really strong contrast when something bad does happen. Then it's a sudden shift to the dramatic.
Right. He lures you in a little bit, and then he spanks you.
Exactly.
But he was the genius of that. He always said that he wanted to play the audience like a piano. Like, if I hit this note, you're going to do this. If I hit that note, you're going to do that. And that's kind of what he wanted to do with all his movies.
Yeah, exactly. And, he said that the camera is like a musical instrument.
Mm-hmm.
In that the close-ups, are the most important notes, and then the wide shots are other notes, and it's all about emphasis and rhythms, and so that every moment carries with it a certain emphasis, and that all of your close-ups are your emotional story, and all the wide shots are more objective. And so that's why he was able to storyboard all of his films beforehand, and the editors would have no choice,
Follow exactly what I did, right?
There's only one way to cut it, because he would only shoot exactly what was needed in terms of close up here, wide shot here, medium shot here, and so that was all part of his plan going in, was that orchestration of the camera.
It was never found in the edit, like most movies
Right.
are. It's never found in the edit or recut in the edit. He had such a clear vision of what he was attempting to do. I'm sure at one point or another he must have run into some trouble, but maybe he didn't. Maybe he was such a master that he just always cut it exactly the way he had it on paper, which is insane, but true.
Yeah.
Now,
And his producers didn't like that either, because, especially back in the 40s and 50s,
yes.
Producers were all about, controlling and changing the edit.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't do it with his films, because there was no other way to cut it. There was no other footage to use in the scene. So
Well, that's a smart way to maintain director's cut, I guess.
Exactly.
Now, can you discuss, in the book you discuss a little bit about the syntax of eyes, hands, and feet. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah. Basically, this is all about telling the story. Those are the words that you have in the visual sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're crafting a visual sentence, you have eyes, hands, and feet, and objects which the hands can manipulate. Mm-hmm. So I compare it to a computer game. Mm-hmm. There's a type of computer game. I don't know if it's still out there, but in the 90s there was a type of computer game where it's like where you're in a room and there's objects, and you have to you tell the character to look at this object, grab this object, and by putting two objects together, you create a tool that you can escape the room. So that's kind of. And that's the way of bringing the player into the world and to manipulate the story of the game is through objects. It's the same way in a suspense film, because by focusing on objects and by telling the story through objects, then that's how you bring the audience in. It makes them feel like they're a part of the story, and that they can, if they could reach in, then they could manipulate the film in the same way.
Now, Hitchcock was a master of building danger off screen. Can you share a few tips on how Hitchcock did it so well?
Off screen, So basically, what you don't show.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Basically, like when you, instead of showing the murder, you hear the murder.
Oh, yeah. So, that's the thing. Once you build up the suspense, you really don't have to show it because the audience is already so involved. And you, by not showing it, like for instance, there's an episode of his TV show called Revenge where he actually has a murder that takes place off screen. A guy walks into a hotel room and the camera stays on the door of the hotel. And you see the man walk in and walk off camera. And then you hear him stabbing the guy and killing him, but you don't see it. But you know it's happening and the camera doesn't move. So all you have is this empty shot of this doorway. And that is, it's more, scary than showing it because it's in your head. Because you've evoked the imagination, and it happens in your head. It's not on the screen.
So like the perfect example is the Psycho shower sequence, which is probably one of the most studied sequences in film history. The knife never penetrates her. It never cuts her at all. In the entire sequence, but yet the mind connects all of those images. I think it was like 78 shots, 98 shots, something like that in a 45-second or 30-second. I don't even remember exactly the numbers, but all of those shots connected into a murder sequence, but you never actually see an actual murder. Arguably, you don't ever see that knife penetrate her skin. So that is the master. I mean, he took 3 days to shoot that, 2.5, 3 days to shoot 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Must be nice to be the boss back then.
And that's all about montage and the brain finds its own continuity,
Mm-hmm. It was just I actually worked at Universal Studios, Florida, back in the day in the 90s, and they had the Hitchcock ride, which I literally would just sit and just stay in there forever. And they had a whole live presentation of the shower sequence. They brought the set out, the way the walls would fall away, and all this kind of stuff. It was just fascinating to watch. So, can you talk a little bit about the Hitchcock brand and how Hitch was the first director to really brand himself?
Yeah. And, this started, he actually, when he was a teenager, he was actually in marketing. Mm-hmm. He works at a company that made telegraph cable. Mm-hmm. And so he was in the marketing department of, I guess he designed the catalog or something, the product catalog. And he also designed, advertisements that they would publish elsewhere. And so he was involved in marketing and publicity early on. So by the time he became a director, like in his mid-20s, he already had this background, this intimate kind of knowledge of the underpinnings of advertising. And so he knew how to promote himself. And he would actually that's part of why he kept putting cameos of himself in his films, because he realized that the newspapers would talk about it. In fact, they would talk more about him than the actors, and that was kind of unheard of at the time.
It's still actually unheard of. There's not many directors that get more of a spotlight than the actors in their movies or the movies themselves.
Yeah, and so he would do that. He would manipulate the press like that. In fact, he would actually plant stories about his weight, and getting the press to talk about the fact, he lost 20 pounds last week, mm-hmm. and here's how he did it. So he's getting people to think about his image, because part of his brand is that profile, that unique profile of his face. And so any way he could get the press to talk about it, then that was publicity for him. And so what you see in his films is that his brand and his persona is so interweaved into his style, into his camera moves, and everything about his films, so that even today, 40 years later, you still feel his presence.
You do. You do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So you feel this director telling a story, and you feel like he's still there.
And there's not many guys from his time that still has that resonance, that just sits there, and it just, everybody knows that profile. Anyone who's watched movies has heard of Hitchcock. He's just one of those directors, and he's just a masterful. You're right. He was masterful in branding, and I think that's something that's so missing today in cinema in general, and for specifically indie filmmakers, is the branding aspect of things, the marketing aspects of things. And he was a master not only of suspense but of marketing. I remember the Psycho release. What a masterful marketing campaign that was! That he would shut the door at a certain time and not let anybody else in, and he asked, make sure don't ruin it for anybody. And it's pretty masterful back then. And how much control do you think he had over the marketing of his films?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm sure he had, quite a bit of input.
More than most.
Yeah. Especially during the 60s, because by 1960, he was like the biggest director ever. So,
there was a golden,
you could pretty much get anything you wanted.
Yeah, there was a golden age of his work, which started with, what film did you think he would be? Like, because there's that group of like 6 or 7 movies that he was just at the top of his game. The Vertigo, The Rear Window, Psycho, North by Northwest, that period. Do you know what the years were by any chance?
Yeah. So pretty much, 1950s up to 1960. Psycho was 1960, which is kind of the end of that kind of golden era, because after Psycho, he kind of went a different direction.
Yeah. Then he started, he already had his TV show at that point.
Right. And the TV show started in 55.
Right.
And I think that would be the year that he was probably at his peak. Because he was making like 3 or 4 films a year at that point. I mean, within a very short span of time, he had Rear Window and North by Northwest and Vertigo and all these films, and
all masterpieces at that time. Yeah. Without question, he was hitting home run after home run during that period, and I do remember. Go ahead.
And he was about 55 at the time, so because he was born in 1899, so you can easily figure out his age. So it's just if you're not 55 yet as a filmmaker, there's still hope. Right.
Without question.
Because he took a while.
It took him. But he worked, but it took him a while before he hit his stride. And I do remember the story of Psycho, that the studio didn't want to give him the money, or they gave him a really low budget. So he took his TV crew, and that's who made the movie, which was unheard of at the time, a television crew doing a feature film for a studio.
Yeah.
And he did that. And that's how he was able to move so quickly and so on. Like I said, I'm a little bit of a Hitchcock fan as well. So I like to geek out with some Hitchcock every once in a while. Now, what are some current day films that Hitchcock would be proud of, in your opinion?
I think 10 Cloverfield Lane is one of the ones that comes to mind recently. Dan Trachtenberg. I actually have an interview with him in the book. That I think is very Hitchcock. A lot of the Coen brothers' work is very Hitchcock. I think the reason the similarity there is because of the humor, the use of comedy, which was really important to Hitchcock's work as well. Because Hitchcock, he said that it's entertainment. You don't want to depress the audience, so you have to keep things light and fun. So even in the darkest scenarios, he would always find a way to make it funny and insert a little bit of humor or irony.
And
so that you're
and macabre as well.
yeah, exactly.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show.
So that you're always kind of on the edge between laughs and screams. So it's just kind of teetering back and forth between those two. And so, that's what the Coen brothers do.
Mm-hmm.
And, David Fincher obviously does a lot of Hitchcockian type of work. And, I like to compare the Bourne Identity films to Hitchcock. Very similar, especially the first one, because, it's a similar type of character, like being chased through geographic space and kind of hiding and, uncovering information. And so that's very similar to what Hitchcock would do. So, yeah. Oh, and also the new series on HBO called Room 104.
Yes, the Duplass brothers.
Yeah, a lot of Hitchcockian type of work there. There's some episodes that are just really, really awesome suspense.
I mean, would you agree that I think that indie filmmakers have a tremendous opportunity on a lower budget to really tell some fascinating stories if they're able to employ some of Hitchcock's techniques, and not only in the horror or in the thriller, but just as it's suspenseful, telling a good story, but using the camera and not using a lot of dialogue, which I know that's hampers a lot of filmmakers who are not writers to try to tell that story visually. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't need a lot of money for this. And, I think that if Hitchcock were alive today, he would be, he would have a web series. He would have a YouTube channel,
It'd be a hell of a YouTube channel.
He was always about experimenting with new things, new formats. And that was a big deal when he went to television in the 50s because nobody else was doing that.
That's right.
So
that was the that Hollywood hated television when it first came out.
So yeah, you can, anybody can do it.
Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all my guests. Can you tell me what book had the biggest impact on your life or career, besides your own book, of course?
Well, I think with Hitchcock, it would have to go back to the Francois Truffaut interview book.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of that. It took me about 3 years to actually read that book because I was like reading parts of it, off and on. But yeah, that was so inspiring.
Oh, God, it was the first time Truffaut, who was considered an auteur, interviewed Hitchcock, which at the time Hitchcock was kind of considered just kind of like he just makes popular movies. He's not to be taken too seriously. And Truffaut was the one that brought him into the spotlight. And oh my God, this guy really has some thought behind what he's doing. And there is technique and there is art with what Hitchcock was doing. And if anyone listening has not read the Hitchcock Truffaut book, it's required reading for all filmmakers, as well as the documentary Hitchcock Truffaut, which I just saw recently, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Now,
but the book is a lot better.
Oh, of course, no, the book is a lot denser, but the doc really talks a lot about how they put it together and just how funny Hitchcock was, like the pictures they took and why they took the pictures and all that kind of good stuff. Now, what lesson took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life? I know these are deep.
What lesson took me the longest to learn? Well, the one thing that I think is important is to always impose limitations onto yourself and onto your work. And that's where the most creativity comes from. So that if you start out a film and you say, okay, it's just going to be handheld camera shots, we're not going to use a tripod, and we're just going to use natural lighting. Okay, if you decide that's how you're going to do it, stick with it. Because what can happen is that, you can be pushed into expanding and doing bigger things. And then the film might become too much of a monster to handle.
Right.
So always, you want creative limitations. I think that's an important thing.
So low budgets actually make you a better filmmaker.
Yeah, I would say so.
I preach that all the time. If you're given $100 million, you have no idea, and you just throw the money hose at problems, you never learn.
Yeah.
But if you can't figure it out, then you have to try to figure it out because there is no other option. It's kind of like burning the boats once you get to the shore. Like there's no going back.
Yeah.
Now, what are 3 of your favorite Hitchcockian films of all time?
Hitchcockian, you mean
The Hitchcock
not necessarily
films.
Hitchcock?
No, Hitchcock films. Hitchcock films.
That always changes for me because there's so many.
Yes.
And each time I see one, it's different, and it kind of changes.
As of for today.
Well, I recently saw I Confess, which is an early black and white Hitchcock film, and I really like that. I was surprised by it. It's one of the lesser known films. Also, I like Strangers on a Train.
Which one? Because there's 2 Strangers on the Train, if I remember correctly.
It's the
black and white? The first one? Okay.
Yeah.
Not the remake, because he remade his own movie a couple decades later. If I'm not mistaken, right?
That was Men Who Knew Too Much, I think.
So there's 2 men who knew too much.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. Excuse me. Thank you for correcting me. Yes.
Yeah, because that's the film he remade of his earlier British version.
Got it. Strangers on the Train is great, actually. I love Strangers on the Train.
That's a good film too, by the way. And I also like Rope.
I love
and
Rope.
You said you're getting ready.
No, we can't talk about anything. Can't talk about anything. We can't talk about anything.
But the style of a single shot. That's camera orchestration right there. If you want to learn about orchestration,
yeah,
watch that movie. He
did 7 takes in that whole movie?
Yeah.
Yeah,
but it's all as if one take.
Right.
Or there's a couple of cuts, but they're dramatic cuts.
Right.
But
exactly.
But it's all about, a dolly in on an important moment, it's all the shots are there, but right. You just don't cut. You move the camera instead of cutting. So
yeah, I read somewhere that he was not, years later, he felt kind of discouraged by Rope because he felt that it wasn't his best work and it was just an experiment gone wrong, in his opinion, is what I read. Which I disagree with Mr. Hitchcock respectfully. I think Rope it's a masterpiece as well. But I guess at the time it was not well received, only years later. But that's a lot of great art is not well received. I mean, look at Kubrick.
Yeah.
I mean, every Kubrick movie that came out, everyone was like, and then 10 years later, masterpiece.
Yeah.
Now,
and he tried it again with Under Capricorn, and that film didn't work. So it may be the failure of that second try that caused him to give up on the whole idea. But yeah, still.
I would like to see him with a digital. I still like to see him with a digital camera today, and he could just shoot forever and not have to worry about it. I always wondered, like, what would Kubrick, what would Hitchcock, and some of these great directors, Kurosawa, all these great directors of yesteryear with today's technology, what they would do, and what amazing art that would be created today. Now, where can people find you online, and where can people get the book?
Okay, well, the book is available. Most major booksellers. It's in Barnes & Noble. It's on Amazon. You can get it from the publisher at mwp.com, michaelwiesiproductions.com. And my website is borges.com, borgus.com. You can Google my name. You'll find things.
You have an amazing YouTube channel as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. I'm saying it as a statement, and please tell people about it.
Well, okay, it's Borges Film on YouTube, and we have our Hitch 20 series, which it's 3 hours of detailed analysis of Hitchcock's 20 episodes of television.
That's insane.
And that is definitely something to check out.
Yeah, I actually, when I was doing research on Hitchcock, I came across your site, and I think that's how we kind of ran into each other eventually. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show. I started posting some of your stuff as well, because it was just such good stuff, and there's just nothing out there like it. So if you guys are interested in Hitchcock at all, I'll put all this in the show notes so you guys can go check it out. But the videos are a great companion to his book, and the book again is called Suspense with a Camera: The Filmmaker's Guide to Hitchcock's Techniques. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being on the show, man. It has been an absolute pleasure geeking out with Hitchcock and yourself.
Great, thank you.
Hitchcock was the master. He's arguably one of my top 5 directors of all time. And if you are a filmmaker, you are doing yourself a disservice if you do not study Mr. Hitchcock's work. And in all honesty, if you guys are going down the rabbit hole on Alfred, please check out Jeffrey's amazing 20-episode series on every episode he ever directed on the Alfred Hitchcock Presents show. And they break down everything about those episodes and really gives you an insight on what Hitch was doing during those years. And I'll have all the links to everything from Jeffrey's book to his video series and everything he does at our show notes for this episode at indiefilmhustle.com/193. And I want to thank you for all the emails and all the questions I've been getting from the tribe for the new show, Ask Alex. I really appreciate it. And please, it's not too late. Please send more questions. I'm still picking and choosing which ones I'm going to use. Just email me at ifhsubmissions@gmail.com. Leave me your question, and I will take a read of it and see if it gets on the show. But please send the questions. I want to read them. I want to answer them as best I can. So thank you, guys. And tomorrow we will be releasing the next installment of the Director series on our YouTube channel. This week is Christopher Nolan and breaking down Batman Begins. Definitely, it's just such a geek fest. I love that episode so much. If you're a Nolan fan, please check it out at indiefilmhustle.com/YouTube, and you can subscribe on our YouTube channel. And guys, we're almost at 10,000. I think by tomorrow we might break 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. So grateful, so humbled, and growing. And also our Facebook page. If you haven't been to our Facebook page, definitely check it out. We're almost at 50,000 likes on our Facebook page. So the audience is growing. The tribe is growing. So please keep spreading the word as much as you can to everybody you know, and try to help. I'm trying to help as many filmmakers as we can out there around the world. So for all of my listeners in the U.S., happy Halloween. Don't eat too much candy. Scare the hell out of people. Oh, and by the way, I just have to, on a side note, if you guys, any of you guys out there have Netflix, you need to watch Stranger Things. For God's sakes, please watch Stranger Things. I just finished binging it on Saturday, and it was amazing. If you like the first season, the second season is great. No spoilers, I promise, but just watch it. It's so great. It's such a wonderful study in nostalgia and how the Duffer Brothers put together these amazing stories. We actually released a whole bunch of articles last week about exactly how they do character and break down character and all that kind of good stuff. But finally saw it. Definitely check it out on Netflix, guys. And as always, keep that hustle going, keep that dream alive, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Indie Film Hustle podcast at indiefilmhustle.com. That's INDIEFILMHUSTLE.com.